Tonight, we begin with revelations that Western intelligence agencies had feared, military analysts had anticipated, and Kremlin watchers had desperately prepared for, admissions that unfolded not over months of careful investigation, but in 72 hours of explosive leaks. 72 hours that exposed the fractures within Russia's military command. 72 hours that confirmed what many had long suspected about the war in Ukraine. 72 hours that may have permanently altered the balance of power in Moscow. What Putin's generals admitted this week crossed a line that the Kremlin had desperately hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Western intelligence services did not hesitate. They responded with speed, precision, and unprecedented coordination. Multiple senior Russian military officers, generals who have commanded forces in Ukraine, who have sat in war rooms with Vladimir Putin himself, have broken their silence. And what they admitted has sent shockwaves through capitals from Washington to Beijing. This is not speculation. This is not rumor. This is what insiders are now confirming about the state of Russia's war machine, Putin's grip on power, and the shocking truths that have been hidden from the Russian people. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal briefings, just signals that Putin's military leadership was preparing something unprecedented. Putin's generals have been loyal, yes, but they have been strategic in their loyalty. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a choreography of obedience that Western analysts had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in Langley and London this month was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence officers who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the encrypted channels between Moscow and field commanders, the scheduled briefings between generals and the defense ministry, the predictable flow of orders from the Kremlin to the front lines, the sudden absence of criticism from military bloggers connected to senior officers. All of that went quiet, and whenever Putin's military establishment goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The silence lasted for 11 days, 11 days of no major communications, 11 days of generals avoiding public appearances, 11 days that made Western intelligence agencies extremely nervous, because silence in the Kremlin doesn't mean peace, it means planning, it means calculation. It means someone is about to make a move that they don't want anyone to see coming. Early Tuesday morning, European intelligence services detected what they described as unusual patterns of encrypted communication traffic, including message bursts that had not been observed in over 14 months. These are the kinds of communications that Putin's generals only use when they are signaling something very specific: internal disagreement, strategic repositioning, or preparation for dramatic action. Analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia's military command was changing its posture. And when military leaders shift posture without explanation, even by small degrees, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. What emerged in the following days would prove more significant than anyone anticipated. 3 senior Russian generals, 2 currently serving and 1 recently retired, began communicating with intermediaries connected to Western journalists and intelligence contacts. Their admissions were methodical, their revelations were specific, and their words painted a picture of Russia's military situation that contradicts nearly everything Vladimir Putin has told the Russian people. The first general, speaking through a trusted intermediary in a European capital, admitted that Russian casualty figures have been systematically falsified since the first month of the invasion. The real numbers, he said, are approximately 3 times higher than official reports. The second general confirmed that Russia's ammunition reserves are far more depleted than Moscow has publicly acknowledged, with certain critical munitions now being rationed at the front. And the third general, perhaps most shockingly, admitted that multiple senior officers had privately expressed concerns about Putin's strategic judgment to his face and were met with what he described as cold silence and reassignment. The intelligence assessment issued by NATO partners tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, briefing after briefing, described the general's admissions as unprecedented, credible, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of systemic dysfunction within Russia's command structure. But intelligence only works if it's acted upon quickly. Western governments did not hesitate. In fact, their response this week was among the most coordinated we've seen in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 48 hours of the first verified admission, NATO intelligence services launched Operation Clarity, a joint assessment initiative designed to verify and expand upon what the generals had revealed. These weren't the standard background checks. These were deep verification protocols, systems that Western intelligence only deploys when they are preparing to act on information at the highest levels. Multiple European governments have now adjusted their military aid packages based on what they learned. The United States has reportedly fast-tracked certain weapon systems that directly address vulnerabilities the generals identified, and Ukraine's military command, briefed on the revelations, has begun planning operations that specifically target the weaknesses now confirmed by Russia's own leadership. Tonight, intelligence sources confirmed that Western agencies launched verification operations on Russian military installations, including command centers that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was preparation for a spring offensive. Western satellites repositioned before Russian electronic warfare systems could adapt. They photographed Supply Depot Krasnodar 7. They photographed the Baltic Fleet's communication hub. They photographed mobile command units that were likely preparing to coordinate the next phase of operations. In other words, Western intelligence targeted Russia's nervous system. The infrastructure that would have made Putin's next moves operational. This is what made the general's admissions so urgent. Russia's military dysfunction wasn't just rumored, it was now being confirmed from inside. It represented the kind of intelligence breakthrough that could reshape the entire conflict if leveraged correctly. And Western powers, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't leak the generals' identities. They didn't compromise ongoing operations. They verified the information quietly. They shared it with Ukraine's command structure. They adjusted their support accordingly, and they prepared for what comes next. The generals admitted that Russian logistics networks have been operating at 60% capacity for months. They admitted that troop morale in certain sectors has collapsed to levels not seen since the Chechen wars. They admitted that Putin's inner circle has become increasingly isolated, dismissing reports that contradict the narrative they've built. And they admitted, in words that intelligence analysts are still processing, that several senior officers no longer believe the war can be won in any meaningful sense. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that the general's decision to break silence was designed to test the receptivity of Western powers after months of perceived hesitation. The generals wanted to see whether NATO would dismiss their claims as disinformation. But instead, the opposite happened. Western intelligence didn't dismiss the information. They verified it with a thoroughness that was so rapid, so comprehensive, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But this week, Western intelligence services did. Senior analysts speaking with major news organizations under strict anonymity described the general's admissions as the most significant internal leak since the Soviet collapse, a way to signal deep fractures within Russia's military establishment. But the admissions proved something else today, that Russia's generals remain both aware of reality and willing to communicate it. Their revelations were not only detailed, they were corroborated so precisely that Western agencies matched them against satellite data within hours. That speed matters because it shows the generals were telling the truth. It shows that Russia's military leadership is not a unified block of loyal servants. They are human beings watching their institution crumble. They are professionals who see the gap between propaganda and reality, and some of them, perhaps more than Moscow realizes, have decided that silence is no longer an option. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of what the generals revealed. General 1, operating from a secure location in Central Europe, carried out detailed briefings with intermediaries, forcing Western analysts to revise their casualty estimates upward by over 40,000. General 2 targeted Russia's ammunition crisis, confirming that certain artillery units have been reduced to firing quotas in the last 3 months. General 3, operating through encrypted channels, reportedly provided organizational charts showing command dysfunction at levels that Western intelligence had only suspected. This wasn't just whistleblowing. This wasn't just strategic leaking. This was institutional confession. This was systemic exposure, and systemic exposure is the one thing Putin has struggled to prevent since the invasion began. For every narrative victory the Kremlin has claimed, reality has countered with something that undermines their credibility. The sinking of the Moskva, the retreat from Kherson, the chaos of the Prigozhin mutiny, and now, the silence of loyalty breaking into the noise of truth. Remember, Putin thought his generals would remain silent forever. He thought fear of reprisal would keep them loyal. He thought the system of rewards and punishments he'd built over 2 decades would hold. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Generals are talking, not to Russian media, but to Western contacts. Intelligence is flowing, not from spies, but from insiders. The wall of silence is cracking, not from external pressure, but from internal recognition that the current path leads nowhere. Putin built his power on the assumption that loyalty could be purchased permanently. He built his military on the assumption that fear would override conscience. He built his war on the assumption that his commanders would never question him publicly. Tonight, those assumptions are being tested as never before. What makes this moment so volatile and so consequential is that the general's admissions happened at a time when Putin is under extraordinary pressure. Military hardliners want escalation, more troops, more weapons, more aggression. Economic realists want stabilization, a path out of sanctions, a return to normalcy. Political opportunists want scapegoats, someone to blame for the failures that have accumulated. And ordinary Russians want answers, explanations for why the special military operation has lasted years instead of days. Putin is balancing these demands while maintaining the fiction that everything is proceeding according to plan. And when leaders in that position face internal dissent, they're not operating from strength. They're operating from pressure. They're operating from vulnerability. They're operating from the recognition that the narratives they've built may not survive contact with reality. The generals who broke silence understand this. They understand that Putin's position is weaker than it appears. They understand that the war has cost Russia far more than the public knows. And they understand, perhaps better than anyone, that the current trajectory is unsustainable. NATO's intelligence assessment, now circulating among member governments, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to ignore credible information from inside Russia's command structure. Officials said plainly that the generals' admissions were consistent with independent intelligence assessments and satellite verification. That is diplomatic language for, "we believe them." You don't usually hear that tone from Western intelligence agencies unless something serious is at stake. The British Foreign Office released a statement noting, concerning patterns of dysfunction within Russian military leadership. The Pentagon confirmed that new information had prompted adjustments to ongoing assessments. And European defense ministers, meeting in Brussels, reportedly spent 3 hours discussing the implications of what the generals revealed. This is not business as usual. This is the Western world processing a potential turning point. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation in a measured, determined speech tonight. He said, "We have always known that the truth would eventually emerge from behind the Kremlin's walls." He said, "Every general who speaks honestly brings us closer to the end of this war." And he said, "Russia's soldiers deserve to know what their commanders already know, that this war cannot be won, only ended." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that internal Russian dissent could accelerate the conflict's resolution. He knows that every crack in Putin's narrative creates opportunities, and he knows that the world is watching to see how Ukraine responds to this moment. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The generals' admissions weren't isolated, along with their revelations about military dysfunction. Russian state media has also shown unusual cracks, with certain commentators questioning the war's progress more openly. Russian business leaders have reportedly intensified private lobbying for a negotiated settlement. Russian regional governors have increased complaints about mobilization quotas targeting their populations. All of this happened within the same 2-week period. When multiple pillars of the Russian system show stress simultaneously, it means something larger is underway. Putin has spent 24 years building a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of coordinated dissent. The fact that it's happening anyway suggests that the pressure has exceeded what even his system can contain. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a dramatic escalation to reassert control and silence internal critics. Another is that Putin is attempting to identify and purge disloyal elements before they can organize further. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to create a crisis atmosphere that justifies emergency measures domestically. But today, the generals took that card off the table. They didn't stay silent. They didn't protect the system. They didn't pretend everything was fine. They spoke truth to intermediaries who could amplify it globally, and in doing so, they changed the information landscape permanently. You cannot unknow what has been revealed. You cannot unspeak what has been admitted. You cannot rebuild a wall of silence once it has been breached. What we're watching now is a test of institutional loyalty. Putin wants to see whether his remaining commanders will hold the line. The generals who spoke want to see whether their admissions will inspire others. Western intelligence wants to prevent the situation from escalating into something uncontrollable, and Ukraine wants to prevent Russia from recovering its strategic footing. Every actor in this drama is calculating their next move based on what the others might do. Every decision carries consequences that could ripple for years. Every silence is a choice. Every word is a weapon. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian command communications with unprecedented intensity. They say Putin has ordered a comprehensive review of senior officer loyalty. They say multiple generals have been summoned to Moscow for consultations that may determine their futures. And they say the Kremlin's decision to remain publicly silent about the leaks is likely part of a damage control strategy intended to minimize attention while internal purges proceed. But the generals who spoke are not retreating. In fact, additional contacts have been established with Western intermediaries. Their response this week, coordinated, verified, and amplified, sent a message to Putin that the wall of silence has permanent cracks, and it sent a message to the Russian military that speaking truth is now possible. As the weeks go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin's generals hope to achieve by breaking their silence. But what we do know is that their admissions were timely. They confirmed what Western intelligence had long suspected. They provided Ukraine with actionable information about Russian vulnerabilities, and they demonstrated that even the most controlled systems can produce dissent under enough pressure. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming weeks. If he responds with purges and escalation, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of his system's visible decay. If he attempts to negotiate from a position of acknowledged weakness, Western powers have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown they are watching. And tonight, for the first time in years, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely uncertain. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times but never fully accepted. Loyalty purchased with fear eventually fails. Systems built on lies eventually crack. And generals who see reality will eventually speak it. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The silence has been broken. The truth has begun to emerge. And the world will never see Russia's military the same way again. The generals have spoken. The admissions have been made, and now we wait to see whether more will follow, or whether the Kremlin will find a way to rebuild the walls that have begun to crumble. One thing is certain, the information landscape has changed. What was hidden is now known, what was whispered is now documented, and what was feared has now been confirmed. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.